Hey guys, tonight we will unveil the secret of a horrific death, where the greatness of an empire collapsed before the cruelty of disease. What if your final moments were not a peaceful passing, but stretched into 53 days and nights of continuous torment? Imagine you are the monarch holding supreme power globally, yet you are forced to endure the sight of your own body necrotizing, being torn apart by carrion-feeding organisms while you remain completely conscious. All you can hear are the fearful, whispered prayers of your courtiers outside your chamber. This is neither a fictional horror story nor an ancient legend. This is the accurately documented end of Philip II of Spain. The emperor, who once commanded a vast empire where the sun never set, was transformed into a mass of agonizing, decaying flesh, an indelible stain on medical history. In the summer of 1598, inside the austere walls of El Escorial Palace, an unpleasant odor began to creep through the corridors. It was no ordinary foul smell. It was the living putrefaction emanating from the king's own bed. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you are watching from and what time it is, your local time, in the comments below. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. If there is one death before which history itself must bow, it is that of Philip II, the king who once held in his hands an empire upon which the sun never set. In the year 1598, at the age of 71, he entered the final 3 days of his life, a horrifying, very real ordeal, recorded in painstaking detail by European chroniclers. During that time, the king's body slowly decomposed, while his mind remained painfully alert, and the palace of El Escorial, his pride, the monument of both power and faith, became a prison of decay. The first hint was a faint odour drifting through the cold stone corridors, which the servants assumed came from a dead mouse trapped in the walls. But soon the stench spread through every chamber, seeping into velvet draperies and even the sacred relics. It was not the smell of an ordinary corpse, it was the smell of a living body rotting from within. In the narrow chamber where the king lay, a single shaft of light fell through a small window onto the tiled floor, where physicians, priests, and courtiers knelt in silence, praying for a miracle they already knew would never come. Philip had once been hailed as the defender of the Catholic faith, ruler of Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, Naples, Milan, and the far-flung dominions of the Americas and Asia. He was the sovereign of an empire where the sun never set, the man who commanded fleets to cross oceans and made all of Europe tremble, when he faced Queen Elizabeth of England in the War of 1588. Yet that same power, the power that could redraw the map of the world, could not save his own flesh. This story does not begin with death, but with the slow collapse of the body. Each passing day, pain from gout-stricken legs left him nearly unable to move. The hands that had signed thousands of decrees now trembled, swollen, and inflamed. He no longer had the strength to climb the small altar in his private chamber, where he had prayed daily for decades. When the fever struck, it seemed at first to be a simple summer chill, but no one could have imagined that it was the first signal of the 53 most dreadful days in royal history. El Escorial, which Philip had built as a temple of God on earth, now became a torture chamber of the very faith he worshipped. Silver crucifixes hung on the walls. Golden chalices glimmered beside Latin scriptures he had long memorized. Yet amid the stifling odor of necrosis, even the priests trembled as they prayed. The royal physicians, once considered the finest in the kingdom, could only take turns wiping the sweat from his brow and murmuring prayers, for no remedy remained effective. They tried everything 16th century medicine could offer: herbal draughts, burning candles of incense, wax poultices, even cauterizing the wounds with red-hot metal to halt the decay. But the king's body continued to erupt with boils, swelling, and oozing pus, as though it had turned against its master. Outside the sick room, courtiers moved in silence, every footstep echoing like an omen. None dared to speak loudly, none dared to weep. In that thick, oppressive air, everyone felt something beyond human comprehension was unfolding. Each muscle, each bone, each vessel within the king seemed to rebel, rising against the man who had once commanded an empire that spanned the world. In one corner, an hourglass flowed quietly, marking each grain of time across 53 endless days. And amid the faint groans of the monarch, between the scent of incense and the stench of rotting flesh, history bore witness to one of humanity's starkest moments, where absolute power bowed before the truth of mortality, where a mighty sovereign was forced to watch his own body disintegrate, slowly, hour by hour, minute by minute. From this moment, the 53-day journey of Philip II began a journey of helplessness, of faith pushed to its breaking point, and of a death that refused to arrive until the soul itself surrendered beside the ruined body. Philip II was born in the year 1527, the only legitimate son of Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, and Isabella of Portugal. From the very beginning, his destiny was bound to empire. By the age of 30, he ruled a realm so vast that no sunset ever fell upon all of it at once. A dominion that stretched across Europe, the Americas, the Philippines, and Italy, united under his name and his seal. He was, in every sense, a monarch forged by order and faith. Raised within the shadow of both the church and the crown, Philip believed that discipline was divine. He lived not as a man of pleasure, but as a clerk of God's will, a ruler who viewed administration as a form of prayer. His desk, not his throne, was his true altar. From dawn until deep into the night, he laboured alone in his private chambers, reading and signing document after document, his hands stiff with exhaustion. It is said that he personally reviewed thousands of papers each day, refusing to delegate authority even in the smallest affairs. He trusted few, and loved fewer still. This obsession with control came at a cost. He slept rarely, ate irregularly, and denied himself the softness of leisure. He prayed for hours on stone floors, knelt until his knees bruised, and spent long nights awake under the flickering light of candles that never seemed to go out. The body that once commanded armies and built cathedrals began to crumble under the quiet weight of this unyielding devotion. By the time he reached his 7th decade, his flesh had become the prison of his spirit, the result of decades of prayer, fasting, and sleepless labour. The physicians of his court had long warned him. His sedentary life, his endless sitting, and his refusal to move except to kneel in prayer were slowly destroying his circulation. But Philip considered pain a companion sent by heaven, a test of endurance, a small penance on the road to salvation. When the first symptoms of gout appeared, swelling his feet and hands until he could barely hold a pen, he bore it without complaint. The disease, a scourge of kings, soon worsened. His joints burned as if filled with molten lead, and walking became an ordeal that left him gasping for air. Then came edema, the swelling of the legs and abdomen, a visible mark of the body's rebellion. His once slender frame grew distorted, his feet ballooned until his shoes no longer fit, and his attendants were forced to wrap his legs in linen, soaked with wine and herbs. Still, he refused to rest. Each day, he forced himself to sit upright at his writing table, even as the pain clawed through him. His attendants whispered that he had become a living relic, an object of devotion and dread. Philip's entire being revolved around the certainty that every suffering was a divine trial. He saw illness not as punishment, but as proof that God had not abandoned him, but rather chosen him for purification. When he could no longer rise to pray before the chapel altar, he had a small crucifix placed beside his bed, so that even in sickness he could fix his eyes upon the image of Christ. He endured in silence, whispering Latin prayers through clenched teeth, his lips pale from fever. Yet, as the years passed and the agony deepened, that faith, once unshakable, began to tremble. For all his prayers and his sacrifices, the disease did not abate. His body betrayed him, inch by inch, and every prayer seemed to echo unanswered through the vaulted halls of El Escorial. The man who had once ruled continents could no longer command his own limbs. The body that had bent nations now bent itself, involuntarily, beneath the weight of pain. Outside his chamber, El Escorial remained a world of solemn beauty. The golden glow of candles, the echo of monks chanting psalms, the measured footsteps of servants moving along endless corridors of grey stone. The empire still turned, the ceremonies still continued, and the faithful still prayed for their king. But within the heart of that grand monastery palace, the ruler of half the known world was fading quietly, dissolving into the very silence he had built around himself. There, between the walls he had raised as monuments to discipline and devotion, Philip II began to lose the one thing he had spent a lifetime guarding: control. For For decades he had mastered armies, nations, and souls. But now, alone in his chamber, with gout gnawing at his bones and swelling drowning his breath, he faced the one force he could not command, the slow betrayal of his own flesh. And as the flicker of candlelight trembled across the stone walls, it seemed that even El Escorial, the proud monument to divine order, held its breath, waiting, as its master's faith was tested against the relentless truth of mortality. In the spring of 1598, the body of Philip II finally began to surrender. What started as a fever diagnosed by his physicians as tertian ague or malaria soon revealed itself as something far more insidious. The illness did not burn out as fevers usually did. Instead, it settled into his flesh, spreading quietly, corrupting slowly. His once upright frame became swollen and heavy, his breathing shallow and labored. Within weeks, his legs and abdomen puffed grotesquely with dropsy, what modern medicine would call edema, the accumulation of fluid that marked a heart and kidneys near collapse. He could no longer walk. The pain in his gout-ridden joints made even the smallest movement unbearable. Confined to his bed, Philip's body pressed against the same spots hour after hour, day after day. The skin, deprived of blood, began to redden and crack. Then came the blisters, small at first, then larger, until the surface burst and left behind raw, glistening wounds that refused to heal. The physicians of the time had no understanding of infection, no concept of bacteria. They called these lesions bed ulcers, believing them to be a natural consequence of long illness. But they did not realize they were watching the king's body begin to decompose while he still breathed. The ulcers deepened. What had been no more than sores turned into gaping craters of infected flesh, from which seeped a thin, foul-smelling liquid. Servants changed the linens constantly, but the odor could not be masked by incense or herbs. The air of the royal chamber thickened with a sweetness that clung to everything, the unmistakable scent of living rot. Desperate to halt the decay, the court physicians turned to every remedy known in the 16th century. They bled him with leeches, hoping to draw out corrupt humours. They prepared infusions of rosemary, sage, and myrrh. They burned incense of sandalwood and amber to purify the air. They whispered prayers and anointed his skin with holy oils. But there were no antibiotics, no understanding of sanitation, and no way to fight the invisible armies multiplying beneath his skin. The very instruments used to treat him were often unwashed, their edges still crusted with residue from earlier ministrations. And then one morning came the moment that froze even the most hardened attendants. As they peeled away the blood-soaked bandages from the king's lower back, the wounds moved. Not the twitch of living muscle, but a slow, deliberate writhing. Within the gashes of his flesh, white larvae maggots writhed in clusters, feeding on the royal body. The sight was unspeakable. The smell was worse. A priest fainted. A young page fled the room, his screams echoing through the stone corridor before the guards dragged him back. Yet Philip himself, delirious though he was, understood what had happened. The most powerful man in Christendom, the self-proclaimed instrument of God's will, had become food for the lowest of his creations. The worms that burrowed through the soil now burrowed through the body of a king. It was not only a medical calamity, it was a spiritual collapse. In the collective mind of the court, it was as though the divine order had inverted the sacred flesh of God's anointed, devoured by creatures of filth. No one dared speak of it aloud. The physicians ordered the doors sealed, and incense burned day and night to disguise the stench. The attendants washed their hands in wine and vinegar, muttering prayers for forgiveness as they worked. Still, every dawn brought more worms. The doctors, in their desperation, applied salves made of pitch and mercury to kill the infestation. The larvae died, but the flesh burned. And from the wounds that scabbed, new ones opened elsewhere. The palace of El Escorial, once a beacon of faith and majesty, was now a place of dread. The courtiers avoided the upper wing where the king lay. Even the monks whispered of curses and divine punishment. But within those walls, duty held them prisoner. The royal physicians continued to dress the wounds. The confessors continued to read psalms. They all knew they were losing him not to a swift death, but to something far slower, more monstrous. Day after day, they watched the ruler of Europe being eaten alive. The body that had worn silk and gold now glistened with pus. The man who had commanded oceans now struggled for breath within a few square feet of bed linen. Yet even as his body decayed, His consciousness remained clear enough to feel the torment. It is said that when a servant once wept beside him, Philip whispered, "Do not grieve. God has chosen me for this." Outside, the spring winds of 1598 swept across the monastery gardens, carrying the scent of blossoms that never reached his chamber. Inside, the only fragrance was that of decay, and so began the true descent, not the death of a king, but the slow undoing of a man who believed he could endure anything that heaven required of him. Day after day, El Escorial transformed into something between a chapel and a morgue, a living tomb for its master. The doctors came and went like mourners at an endless vigil, their faces pale with failure. No medicine worked. They sprinkled crushed herbs on the wounds, burned incense until the corridors filled with smoke, and recited prayers in Latin as they pressed cloth against his rotting flesh. But each wound grew larger, not smaller. The moment they cleared one sore, another appeared. Wherever their hands had touched, the skin broke anew, softening into pus and blood. The body of Philip II had become a battlefield, flesh against worms, pain against faith. The doctors fought with iron, flame and prayer, but the flesh always won. They poured chemicals of alum and spirits to burn the maggots, only to see new clusters hatch within hours. Each cauterization sizzled through the room, the smell of scorched flesh mingling with the metallic sting of wine and oil. The air grew heavy, thick, suffocating. Even the candles seemed to dim, their light devoured by the stench. And through all this, Philip remained conscious. He was not spared by fever or delirium. The king felt every cut, every burn, every crawling movement beneath his skin. He could smell himself dying, a sweet, rotten scent that clung to his sheets and his soul alike. The chroniclers wrote that he groaned softly, rarely cried out, but his face betrayed the agony his faith forbade him to show. His eyes remained open for hours, fixed on the crucifix above his bed, watching the candlelight tremble upon the face of Christ. The records of his attendants describe horrors that strain belief. The king's back had rotted so deeply that his vertebrae were exposed, gleaming faintly through the wounds. His legs were swollen to twice their size, cracked open by the pressure of fluid. From them oozed a thin yellow discharge that soaked through the bandages and sheets. The smell of decomposition filled every corner of the palace wing. Servants rotated their duties in shifts because none could bear the odor for more than a few minutes. Some fainted, others wretched behind the doorways before returning, faces ghostly pale, compelled by duty and fear. And yet, amid this slow disintegration, Philip insisted on being king. He refused to let the sickness strip him of ceremony. Each morning his secretaries brought him documents for his trembling hand to sign. His fingers, swollen and stiff, barely held the pen, but he forced his name upon parchment, blotting the royal seal with blood when the sores reopened. He dictated letters, gave orders, and in between commands he prayed. Sometimes his lips moved in silence, sometimes in whispers, the words breaking apart between breaths. He believed that to stop working was to surrender not merely to illness, but to sin. The idea of idleness terrified him more than pain. "If I cease my duties," he murmured once to his confessor, "my soul may stray from God." So he laboured, a dying man clinging to ritual, as if it were salvation. The sound of quills, scratching on parchment, mingled with the hiss of burning flesh. The palace, once a symbol of order and divine geometry, now pulsed like a living organism of suffering. The monks continued to chant, their voices echoing through the stone corridors, overlapping with the physician's mutters and the king's faint gasps. El Escorial, built as the house of God and the heart of empire, had become a vault of living death. Outside, the Spanish sun glared over the granite towers, unknowing, uncaring. Inside, beneath those towers, a single man fought a war he could not win against decay, against despair, against the slow undoing of the flesh. Sometimes, when the pain subsided for a brief moment, Philip asked for the window shutters to be opened. The attendants obeyed, and light poured into the chamber, cutting through the gloom. But instead of comfort, the brightness only revealed the truth. The yellowed bandages, the trembling hands, the flicker of insects drawn to the scent of blood. The air shimmered faintly, not with holiness, but with heat and rot. And still he prayed. He prayed for endurance, for meaning, for a glimpse of mercy that never came. He prayed not for death, but for understanding, because even in the shadow of his own ruin, Philip II could not conceive that suffering might be meaningless. Thus, El Escorial, conceived as a beacon of faith, became a shrine to agony. The marble corridors that once echoed with hymns of triumph now carried only the rhythm of his laboured breathing. The great palace of light had turned into a dark sanctuary of rotting flesh and desperate prayer, where every whisper of incense and every cry of pain rose upward, unanswered, toward a silent heaven. While his body continued to decay, Philip II clung with desperate intensity to his religious faith. It was the last structure that had not yet collapsed. Each day he demanded that the monks remain by his bedside, reading aloud from the Holy Scriptures without pause, their voices echoing softly through the fetid chamber. He asked for holy relics, fragments of bone from saints, pieces of cloth said to have touched Christ, and a splinter of the true cross itself to be brought before him, believing they might carry the mercy of God into his rotting flesh. The priests whispered to him, "Your Majesty is being tested as Christ was tested," and he believed them. To Philip, every pang of pain, every hour of fever was a divine trial, a purification of the soul through suffering. He imagined himself as a vessel being purged of sin by fire. Yet even faith, however absolute, has its moments of fracture. When the fever rose and delirium set in, his prayers turned to cries. In the stillness of midnight, between psalms and the buzzing of flies, Philip sometimes wept and whispered, "My God, why do you still keep me alive?" The words dissolved into the heavy air, unanswered. The priests told him that despair was a sin, that questioning God's will was to defy the very faith that had sustained him. So he pressed his lips together, trembling, forcing silence back into his mouth, as though by swallowing it he could keep his soul intact. The chamber around him had become a grotesque fusion of chapel and morgue. Incense smoke drifted like mist, trying to veil the stench of decomposition that clung to every surface. The odour of myrrh and the odour of rot entwined, until neither could be told apart. Candles flickered against the damp stone walls, their trembling light falling upon the hollowed face of a man who had once been the master of half the world. The wax dripped down the brass candlesticks like tears. The faint murmur of prayer merged with the low groans that escaped his lips whenever the physicians moved him. The attendants knelt in silence, hands shaking as they turned his body or wiped the sweat from his brow. They were terrified, not only of what they saw, but of what it meant. The sight of God's chosen sovereign reduced to this. To abandon him would have been a sin, an act of rebellion against divine duty. And so they stayed, servants, monks, and physicians, trapped inside that suffocating room, all participants in a ritual of decay that none dared end. The doctors no longer spoke in front of the king. They worked like ghosts, changing bandages and muttering in Latin, their faces half covered with cloth soaked in vinegar. The sores continued to ooze. Worms reappeared no matter how many they burned away. The king's breath rattled with every exhale, shallow and uneven, yet somehow persistent, as though his soul refused to release a body already half gone. And still he prayed. His trembling hands reached for the relics laid upon his chest, the cold metal of a crucifix, the rough edge of a saint's bone. When his fingers slipped, the priests replaced them, whispering absolution, as if proximity to holiness might ease his torment. But faith had become both his comfort and his cage. It demanded endurance, forbade surrender, and turned his agony into worship. Every moment within that chamber felt suspended outside of time. The chant of monks blurred into the buzzing of flies. The scent of incense merged with that of open wounds. Light and darkness alternated with the rhythm of a dying man's breath. The line between sanctity and horror dissolved completely. In that room, Philip II lay at once, king, sufferer, and martyr of his own devotion. He had built his entire life upon discipline and piety, and now those very virtues had become his tormentors. The man who once governed continents now ruled nothing but pain, and his throne was the narrow bed upon which his flesh surrendered, inch by inch. No one yet knew that what they were witnessing was only the beginning, that ahead lay weeks more of this slow unravelling, the longest and most agonizing vigil ever recorded in royal history. For Philip was not dying as other men die. He was living through his own decay, conscious of every moment, a prisoner of his faith and of his body. enduring each heartbeat as a new confirmation of suffering sanctified. And beyond the locked doors of El Escorial, the empire waited in silence, unaware that its king, once the mightiest ruler on earth, was learning, in the most excruciating way imaginable, that even divine faith cannot save a man from the mortal truth of flesh. News of the king's condition began to seep from his bedchamber into the echoing corridors of El Escorial, then outward to Madrid, and finally across the courts of Europe. Each messenger carried the same refrain: "The king is dying. He will not survive the week. He continues to suffer." The letters repeated this dirge for days, then weeks. Diplomats in France, England, and the Italian states read them with a morbid mixture of awe and dread. A man in such agony, they said, should have died long ago. Yet Philip II remained alive, trapped inside a body that was both living and dead, suspended between two worlds. By now the royal chamber had become a place few could bear to enter. The attendants who nursed him worked in shifts that lasted no more than a few minutes at a time. The sweet, heavy odour of putrefaction clung to their hair, their clothes, their hands. Many left the room to vomit in the hall before returning, pale and trembling. Their daily duties had become a ritual of horror, using tweezers to pluck the larvae from his open wounds, pressing bandages that turned red within moments, and listening to the strained groans that came from the bed, groans that no longer sounded human, but hollow, drawn from a place beyond endurance. What had once been the service of a king had turned into a ceremony of suffering, repeated endlessly without hope or progress. The servants prayed not only for their master's release but for their own. Some begged to be transferred, others confessed nightmares of worms and rotting flesh that haunted their sleep. The palace, with its long stone corridors and marble chapels, had begun to resemble a tomb in waiting. At last, the family was summoned. The visits were carefully arranged, short and heavily managed. The Prince of Asturias, the future Philip III, entered the chamber with the solemnity of one approaching a holy relic. But the sight before him shattered the image of kingship he had known. The father who had ruled him with cold authority, whose word had once shaken continents, now lay motionless, eyes sunken deep into shadow, lips cracked, breath rasping shallowly through the decay. The prince bowed, unable to speak, while the physicians stood silent, their faces turned downward. The king's daughters also came, but their visits were brief, veiled by ritual and restraint. Heavy curtains were drawn to darken the room, and lamps were lowered so that the full horror of his condition would not be seen. The nuns and priests who stood nearby filled the air with whispered psalms, their voices soft and rhythmic, blending with the wheeze of their sovereign's breath. Each prayer seemed less a plea for life than a lullaby for the dying. Within this stillness, faith and ritual became both refuge and prison. Every word of scripture was a rope binding him to life. Every act of devotion another thread in the net of endurance that would not let him fall. The priests surrounded his bed in constant rotation, murmuring reassurances. "Endure, Your Majesty. Despair is a mortal sin." They feared not only for his life but for his soul. For Catholic doctrine taught that despair was a form of rebellion against God. Yet even they could not disguise their fatigue, nor their growing terror of the endless waiting. Philip, though weak and trembling, continued to speak. His voice was faint but clear enough to pierce the heavy silence. He asked again and again the same question. Why am I still alive? Why does God prolong this torment? No one could answer. The priests spoke of penance, of purification, of divine mystery. The physicians lowered their eyes. The attendants pretended not to hear. In that chamber, no truth could be spoken that the king's body refused to die, and no one understood why. Outside the windows, the empire moved on. Ships left the harbours of Seville and Lisbon, carrying silver from the New World. In Flanders, soldiers still fought in his name. In Madrid, the Council of State met daily, issuing decrees as though their sovereign was still at his desk. The empire continued, held together by habit and fear. But inside El Escorial, time had stopped. The ticking of the royal clock seemed slower, heavier. Each hour stretched into an eternity of pain and waiting. Every moment brought a new indignity. The ulcers widened, the skin split, his bones pressed against the sheets. Every motion turning his body, changing the linens, adjusting a pillow drew from him a cry so deep that even the monks flinched. Yet he remained lucid, aware of everything. the murmur of prayer, the clatter of metal basins, the scent of blood and incense mingling in the air. He saw the faces of those around him pale, exhausted, stricken, and understood that they were suffering too. And still, the king endured. His heart, stubborn and strong, beat on when it should have stopped. The man who had ruled through discipline and iron will now seem sustained by the same force that had once built his empire, a refusal to yield, even when surrender would have been mercy. In the end, all that remained to him was awareness, the sound of his own breathing, the smell of his own corruption, and the unceasing murmur of prayers that rose and fell like the tide. The absolute power that had once bent nations was now only memory. Before him lay nothing but the rhythm of decay, breath and rot, faith and futility, echoing through the dim chamber where the greatest king of his age waited, conscious, imprisoned inside the ruins of his own body. From the beginning of August until the middle of September, 1598, the suffering of Philip II reached its most unbearable peak. His back, once broad and strong, had become a single massive ulcer, an open wound so deep that witnesses claimed they could see the faint glimmer of vertebrae beneath the decaying flesh. The stench of rot clung to the very walls of El Escorial, seeping into the wood and the velvet curtains, a constant reminder that the king of the mightiest empire on earth was decomposing while still alive. The swelling in his legs had grown monstrous. The skin shone tight and glassy, stretched by the accumulation of fluid beneath. Then it split first in small cracks, then in deep fissures that oozed ceaselessly. The physicians, following the crude logic of 16th century medicine, decided to relieve the poisoned humours by cutting his legs open to let the fluid escape. But the cuts, far from healing, became new nests for maggots, new doors through which death crept closer. Turning him to relieve pressure was impossible. He could not lie on his back, the wound there was too raw, too vast. He could not rest on his side without reopening the sores. Every pillow, every folded cloth became soaked with pus and blood. The attendants tried every combination of supports, cushions, rolls of linen, even soft straw, but nothing brought comfort. Each attempt to move him triggered a strangled cry, half human, half animal, that echoed through the chamber like a slow tolling bell. The noise of his agony became the soundscape of the palace, a rhythm of muffled screams, whispered prayers, and the endless rustle of changing bandages. They tried leeches again. They tried caustic chemicals that burned the flesh, leaving blackened scars where living tissue had once been. They applied herbal poultices that offered momentary relief before the wounds reopened. Flies swarmed the air despite constant incense. The attendants fanned them away in vain. Every desperate act of healing only added new pain, new burns, new openings for infection. And through it all, Philip's mind remained clear. That was the cruelest miracle of all. He could still think, still speak, still rule. His mind, unclouded by delirium, forced him to experience every detail of his own disintegration. He dictated instructions for the empire between waves of pain. He signed documents, his swollen hand trembling so violently that ink and blood mixed on the parchment. He summoned his secretaries and advisers to his bedside, his words calm and deliberate, even as he gasped for air between sentences. To the courtiers who saw him, it seemed both divine and terrifying, as though his intellect refused to yield even while his body had already become a corpse. The very lucidity that had defined his rule now condemned him to witness, in excruciating awareness, the slow undoing of his flesh. Religious ritual intensified as his condition worsened. From across Spain and beyond, holy relics arrived daily. Fragments of saints' bones, bits of cloth said to have touched the Virgin Mary, and tiny pieces of wood believed to come from the true cross. They were pressed to his cracked forehead, laid beside his bed, suspended above him as if to anchor his soul to heaven. Priests read psalms around the clock, their low voices merging with the sighs of the dying king. Some relics were placed directly upon his body, their cool metal resting against skin so thin and dry that it tore at their touch. Even as the fever consumed him, Philip managed to complete his earthly duties. He dictated the final provisions of his will, giving exact instructions for his funeral rites, for the masses to be sung for his soul, and for the disposition of his personal effects. He named his heir formally, rehearsing words of farewell that his son, Philip III, would later hear through a haze of tears and incense. To those who watched, it seemed clear that the end was imminent. But still, the king did not die. By mid-September, large portions of his flesh had turned completely necrotic grey and leathery, lifeless to the touch. The physicians had stopped trying to remove the maggots, recognizing the futility. Their focus shifted to easing the pain, or at least appearing to. They prepared weak opiates and herbal sedatives, but nothing dulled the agony for long. The king's appetite was gone. He could no longer swallow even broth. Whatever entered his mouth came back up within minutes. His face had hollowed into a mask skin stretched over bone, eyes sunken deep into their sockets, mouth dry and cracked. Yet his abdomen and legs remained grotesquely swollen, distorting his silhouette into something almost unrecognizable. The contrast between the skeletal upper body and the bloated lower half gave him the appearance of two men joined into one, a corpse and a drowning victim. The foreign ambassadors stationed in Spain sent dispatches that read like confessions of disbelief. "The king should have died many weeks ago," wrote one. "He remains conscious and even speaks clearly. It is as if his body refuses to obey the natural order." Modern readers would understand this paradox as the result of primitive medicine. The endless bleeding, the cauterizations, the poisons, treatments that weakened him but never killed him outright. But in 1598, it seemed a miracle or a curse. The priests called it divine endurance. The doctors called it mystery. And so, the longest death in royal history stretched onward. The empire held its breath, while its king, lucid yet decaying, continued to exist in the narrow space between life and death. A soul trapped within a body that would not release him. A monarch reduced to awareness alone, watching himself rot hour by hour beneath the silent, merciless gaze of God. In the latter half of September of 1598, the Spanish court lived in a suspended state, a monarchy without a functioning king, an heir who could not yet ascend. The empire, vast and restless, continued on paper, but its heart had nearly stopped beating within the stone walls of El Escorial. On the 10th of September, after 50 days of suffering that defied belief, Philip II received the sacrament of extreme unction, the anointing of the sick, in a solemn ceremony attended by the highest clergy and members of the royal household. The ritual was meant to mark the threshold between life and eternity. Holy oil was touched to his forehead and his chest. The priests whispered absolution and sang the Te Deum, their voices trembling as they filled the darkened room. In every age, that sacrament was understood as a prelude to death, an act performed when the soul was ready to depart and the body's struggle was ending. But Philip did not die. Hours passed, then days. The candles burned low and were replaced, the incense renewed, the prayers repeated endlessly. The king lingered, breathing shallowly but steadily, his pulse weak yet stubborn. It became a theological puzzle that unsettled the entire clergy of Spain. Could the sacrament be repeated? Was it possible that God himself had withheld mercy, extending the agony to test the monarch's faith? Some whispered that the king's extraordinary suffering was divine punishment. Others that it was divine proof, a sign that even the most exalted of men must be purified through torment before entering heaven. No answer brought comfort. By now, even the attendants had ceased to hope for release. Every sound in the chamber was the sound of endurance, the rasp of cloth being changed, the clink of a silver bowl, the drone of a monk's voice reading from the Book of Psalms. Every hour seemed identical to the one before it, and each carried with it the same question: how much longer could the human body persist when everything inside it had already failed? Finally, on the 13th of September, after 53 days of ceaseless agony, the long vigil ended. At approximately dawn, the witnesses said, the king exhaled softly, not with a gasp or struggle, but with the sigh of one who had simply let go. No final words were recorded. No great gesture marked the moment. His body, exhausted beyond measure, simply released its hold on life. The prayers that had for weeks pleaded for mercy turned now into songs of thanksgiving, for his release was at last complete. Outside the chamber, the machinery of empire resumed at once. Couriers galloped toward Madrid to announce the death to the Prince of Asturias, soon to be Philip III. Messengers rode through the night toward Rome, Paris, and London. The Council of State convened to begin the transition of power. while in the halls of El Escorial, servants prepared for the royal funeral. Yet amid the precision of protocol, one problem loomed above all others: the king's body itself. It was, quite literally, beyond human handling. The flesh was too decayed, too fragile, too infested to permit the usual rites. In the weeks before his death, infection had spread through every limb, and the corruption continued even after breath had ceased. When the embalmers approached the corpse, the stench forced them back. Worms still writhed in the open sores. The skin tore at the slightest touch. The traditional preparation of royal remains, washing, perfuming, dressing in silk and gold, was impossible. The embalmers worked in silence, limiting their contact to what necessity required. They rinsed the body as best they could, dabbing holy water over wounds that no longer bled. Priests stood by, whispering blessings, while the air filled with the sharp scent of myrrh, vinegar, and camphor. Instead of the meticulous embalming reserved for kings, the corpse was wrapped in layer after layer of linen soaked in aromatic oils and preservatives, more to suppress the smell than to preserve the remains. As soon as the final layer was wound, the heavy coffin was closed and sealed immediately, far faster than custom allowed. There would be no public viewing, no lying in state. The people would not see their king's face one last time. The funeral procession that followed, though stately and solemn, carried within its grandeur the quiet horror of what lay inside the sealed casket. Everyone present knew the truth. The king's body was too far gone for the world to witness. In the chapel of El Escorial, the great monastery palace he had built as both his residence and his monument, the coffin was placed beneath the main altar, exactly below the small window through which he had once watched Mass during his final days. The priests intoned the Miserere, their voices rising through the vaulted ceiling, while the courtiers knelt in rows, faces hidden behind handkerchiefs scented with rose oil. There, in the dim light of candles and incense smoke, Philip II of Spain, the man who had ruled an empire that spanned oceans, the man who had believed himself the hand of God on earth, was lowered into his tomb. The marble lid closed with a hollow echo that rolled through the chamber, like the ending of a hymn. Outside, the autumn air of 1598 carried the scent of rain over the hills of Castile. Inside, the stone of the royal pantheon was cold, silent, and absolute. No inscription spoke of the torment that had preceded this peace. No monument could describe the horror of that summer and autumn. The tomb stood serene, dignified, a monument to power eternal. But beneath the stone, the memory of 53 days of suffering lingered, unseen, like the echo of a prayer that had been answered too late. The death of Philip II left behind one of the most thoroughly documented medical records of the 16th century. Monks, physicians, and courtiers all kept careful notes. Their writings, preserved in multiple archives, overlap and confirm one another, forming a remarkably consistent account of his long decline. What emerges from these records is not only a royal tragedy, but a case study, a grim anatomy of endurance that modern medicine can, even now, interpret with chilling clarity. Seen through the lens of contemporary science, Philip's final illness appears as a perfect storm of interacting conditions. At its core lay type 2 diabetes mellitus, though the disease had not yet been identified in his time. The symptoms fit with precision: chronic thirst, slow wound healing, persistent infection, and eventual organ failure. Diabetes quietly sabotaged the king's ability to recover. Every incision, every blister became a portal for infection. His blood, thick with sugar, nourished the very bacteria that consumed his body. Layered upon this was gout, the hereditary curse of European nobility, which inflamed his joints and trapped him in immobility. The gout, in turn, led to circulatory damage, worsening the vascular disease already evident in his swollen legs and discolored feet. Poor circulation starved his tissues of oxygen, allowing the slightest bruise to fester into a wound that could not heal. Lying immobile for weeks created pressure ulcers, bed sores that deepened into open craters. The unrelenting heat of the summer of 1598, combined with the poor sanitation even of royal palaces, transformed those sores into breeding grounds for flies. The result was the invasion that horrified his attendants, maggots feeding on necrotic flesh. Ironically, modern medicine has rediscovered a cleaner, controlled version of this process: sterile maggot therapy, used to remove dead tissue and stimulate healing. But in Philip's case, The infestation was uncontrolled and septic. The larvae burrowed through living and dead flesh alike, spreading bacteria deeper and deeper, accelerating the corruption instead of cleansing it. The pain he endured did not come mainly from the maggots themselves, but from systemic infection, fever, toxin buildup, and starvation. His body was drowning in its own inflammation. As infection spread through his bloodstream, every heartbeat pumped poison to the brain, the lungs, the kidneys. His temperature fluctuated wildly. His breath smelled of acetone, a sign of metabolic failure. The muscles wasted, the skin cracked. Yet somehow the heart continued to beat. How did he live so long under such torment? Physicians today suspect that Philip's body had achieved a morbid equilibrium, a state in which his immune system, though weakened, never completely collapsed. The infection did not erupt into sudden septic shock, the fatal cascade that would have ended his life within hours, but lingered in a steady, smouldering burn. Another explanation lies in the strength of his constitution. Despite decades of poor diet and exhaustion, Philip had reached the age of 71, an advanced age for his era. His organs, especially his heart, may have been unusually resilient, able to sustain him through what should have been a fatal infection. There is also the paradox of treatment as torment. Every intervention his physicians attempted, the draining incisions, the application of leeches, the use of caustic chemicals to burn away infection, the endless rebandaging of wounds, may have kept him alive by preventing total systemic failure. Even as they multiplied his suffering, the bleeding weakened him. The chemicals seared new burns. The constant manipulation reopened wounds that might otherwise have sealed. Modern historians of medicine call such care therapeutic cruelty, the desperate attempt to heal through harm, practiced in good faith by men who did not yet understand the body they sought to save. Yet medicine alone cannot explain the endurance of 53 days of agony. There is also the psychological dimension, the unyielding force of belief. Philip's faith was not a passive comfort. It was an engine of will. He had been raised to view pain as a divine test, a passage through fire toward salvation. Each spasm, each fever, each night without sleep, he framed as a dialogue with God. That conviction, however tragic, gave structure to his suffering. It allowed him to endure consciously what might otherwise have driven him into delirium or despair. But that same unyielding faith was also his final prison. It prevented him from surrendering. His spiritual endurance became a form of resistance against death itself. Modern psychology would recognize this as a paradox of resilience. The same mental fortitude that sustains life also prolongs suffering. Philip did not drift into merciful unconsciousness. He refused to let go of his identity as king, and in doing so kept his mind awake, even when the body begged for silence. To the very end, he clung to ceremony. He signed decrees, gave instructions, prayed aloud, recited Latin psalms, all acts of control, fragments of a kingship, now reduced to ritual gestures. These actions, small as they were, kept his consciousness tethered to the world. In modern terms, he maintained the executive function of rule, not as a political act, but as an existential one. And so, the mind of Philip II became the last fortress to fall. His heart beat on because his will commanded it to. His brain refused to dim until the body itself could no longer sustain it. In the strange balance between biology and belief, medicine and faith, pain and power, he lingered a man who turned discipline into destiny, whose refusal to yield became the mechanism of his own prolonged death. When he finally exhaled that last faint breath on the 13th of September, it was not the victory of death over life, but the surrender of will over endurance, the quiet collapse of a king who had fought even the inevitable with the same relentless devotion he once ruled the world. After the coffin lid was sealed, the Spanish court stepped quietly into a new era. Philip III ascended the throne, but he would never escape the memory of what he had witnessed his father, once the most powerful ruler in Europe, reduced to whispering prayers for death. That image lingered over the new reign like a shadow, a reminder that even kings must beg for release, and that no empire can shield its master from the decay of flesh. Philip II's death marked more than the end of a dynasty. It signaled the collapse of the sacred illusion of power. For centuries, monarchs had ruled under the doctrine of divine right, believed to be chosen by God and thus beyond the reach of ordinary suffering. But in the summer and autumn of 1598, That belief cracked. The story spread quickly from Madrid to Flanders, from Lisbon to Rome, of the king who had been eaten by worms while still alive. It became a legend, whispered in marketplaces and monasteries alike, told not with malice, but with awe and dread. Among the common people, it was seen as a warning. Nobody, however royal, escapes corruption. In churches, priests invoked it in sermons about humility. To them, Philip's agony was a form of divine purgation, a punishment meant to cleanse the sins of a ruler who had waged holy wars, burned heretics, and governed through fear. To philosophers, it became a metaphor, a parable of decaying authority, proof that all earthly power eventually collapses under the weight of its own mortality. The mighty Spanish Empire, which had once claimed to be eternal, suddenly seemed fragile, haunted by the image of its monarch's disintegration. Yet beyond theology and politics, something more profound remained. The stark image of human endurance. Stripped of crown, of ceremony, of divine titles, Philip II had become only a man, a fragile being wrapped in ruined flesh, clinging to faith as his final possession. His torment transcended history, becoming a meditation on what it means to suffer consciously, to remain awake through one's own undoing. Within the granite silence of El Escorial, that transformation became eternal. The king who had built the palace to be both a monastery and a monument was now entombed within it. The corridors he once paced in authority now echoed only with prayers and footsteps of monks. His marble sarcophagus lay beneath the altar, perfectly aligned with the window of his final chamber, the same window through which he had watched Mass during his long dying days. There, stone met silence, and silence became memory. Visitors who came in the years that followed often wrote of the same sensation. The marble, they said, was cold enough to hold the breath of pain. The chapel air, though perfumed with incense, seemed to carry the echo of suffering too vast to fade. Some called it superstition, others called it reverence. But all agreed that within those walls, the air itself seemed to whisper of endurance of the king who had prayed through 53 nights of decay, and of a God who had remained silent through them all. For the clergy, Philip's death continued to serve as a spiritual emblem. Monastic chroniclers described his suffering as a mirror of Christ's passion, a soul purified by agony before reaching divine peace. They recorded every sign of patience, every whispered prayer, as evidence of sanctity. But among the scholars and courtiers who had watched him die, there was a different lesson. That power, no matter how absolute, ends in the same frailty as all mortal lives. The empire he had built from devotion and iron discipline would endure, but never again with the same conviction in divine favour. The El Escorial monastery, once built to embody perfect order, now bore the weight of paradox, the home of faith that had also witnessed its own failure to console. The monks still prayed in shifts, their chants rising over the stone floors where the king had once suffered. The same window that had framed the altar now framed his tomb. The same sun that had once glinted on his crown now fell across cold marble, indifferent, eternal. Those who visited in later centuries wrote that the place seemed untouched by time. The marble corridors shimmered with pale light. The great bronze doors whispered faintly when opened. But the room where the king had died, small, narrow, lined with grey stone, retained a presence that words could not describe. Pilgrims called it the room where God was silent for 53 days. In that silence lies the true legacy of Philip II. Not conquest, nor empire, nor faith triumphant, but the stillness that follows when all illusions of power dissolve. Beneath the carved stone of his tomb, amid the cold order of the palace he built, lies the most human truth of all, that every crown, every body, and every prayer must, in the end, yield to the same quiet, the same dust, the same infinite sleep.